Hello and welcome to the Wildlife Moto channel. So on today's video, we're going to be talking about Cerakoting and how I've been using it as part of the restoration process for my 42-year-old BMW R100CS. Now, I know for a lot of people restoring old classic bikes, Cerakote is probably not the first port of call. You might want to stick to more traditional methods like painting or maybe even powder coating if you're feeling really out there. But Cerakoting is still relatively modern in the grand scheme of things. It was invented, I think, back in the 1980s. So for a lot of people doing old bikes, it's not really something that gets thought about all that often. But I want to make a case for Cerakote today. I want to talk about why I've been using it. I want to show you some of the parts that I've had Cerakote applied to, and we can talk about some of the good stuff, and we'll dip into some of the negative side of Cerakote as well. So let's jump in and have a chat. So back in November last year, I bought this old bike. It's a 1981 BMW R100CS. And since then I have decided to do a complete nuts and bolts restoration on the bike. I'm not being super fussy about being absolutely period correct. And I have decided to bring in a few modern touches to improve the bike and get it ready for life out on the road in 2023. So, Cerakoting, what is it all about and why have I decided to do it? Cerakote, as I said, it started to bubble up around the late 1970s, early 80s, but really it's not until much more recent times that it's become a viable and pretty popular alternative to traditional methods like painting and powder coating. It is inherently more expensive to do Cerakote than it is painting or powder coating. There's more labor involved, there's more preparation work, and it's a little bit more technical in terms of curing processes and stuff like that. And over here in the UK, where we don't have a massive firearms industry, there are fewer people that do Cerakoting. It's probably a different story out in the US, where Cerakote is a very popular coating to use on guns and even knives and things like that. So out there, the industry is probably slightly different. Over here in the UK, you probably pay about twice what you pay for powder coating to get Cerakoting done. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider with Cerakote is, as I said, if you're a proper restorer and you want to be absolutely by the book, and maybe you're going to send this bike into shows and get judged and all that kind of stuff, you'll probably want to stay away from Cerakote as well, because it is very unlikely to have been on your original bike back in the day. So this is something that is quite an aftermarket touch, if you like, but still I think there are some significant merits to it that I want to talk about. So the reason why I chose Cerakote originally was because one of the first jobs that I decided to get done on my R100 was to have all the handlebar controls restored. And they were in an absolutely hideous state when I got the bike. I think somebody had just gone over it with a paintbrush or something like that. So they're absolutely awful, paint just flaking off all over the place and needed to be done. Now I was thinking, well, I could just have these painted, I could get these powder coated as well, but then I was just a little bit worried about how I would put it all back together, and I didn't want to run into issues with clearances and quite fine tolerances and all that, with a kind of levers slot into the housing and all that kind of stuff. So I started doing my research and started thinking about Cerakote, with the key benefit for me at that point being the fact that it is so incredibly thin. It's about 10 to 12 microns thick, which is unbelievably thin. Really, it's ridiculous. All it is like a dust of ceramic particles that are suspended in a polymer resin. So it's very, very thin. You get great clarity in the color. You get a really deep, rich black color without having to apply layers and layers and layers like you would with paint or powder coat. So you're not going to run into any issues at all when it comes to clearances and tolerances and all that kind of stuff for those quite specific parts like handlebar controls and all that stuff. So for me, it was a massive no-brainer. As like, okay, I can completely de-risk this part of the restoration by going with Cerakote. It's going to look great, it should be really durable, plus it's super thin, so I don't need to worry about putting things back together. One of the other benefits that seemed to emerge out of doing the Cerakote was when it came back, I noticed immediately that all of the original details in these parts was still on show. So things like the maker's mark, the BMW logo, the fact that it says made in West Germany, it's a country that doesn't even exist anymore. So to lose that to thick layers of paint and powder coats would take something away from the charm of this old classic bike. So you get to see a lot of the patina and character that is in the underlying material. Because it's so thin, you don't lose any of that detail, which is really nice. That's also pretty useful if you need to maintain things like serial numbers and all that kind of stuff. With Cerakote being so ridiculously thin, anything that's on the part, if it doesn't get blasted away in the process of preparation, will be there on display for everybody to see moving forwards. And I quite like that about Cerakote in general. If you look at any of the parts that I'm putting back on this bike at the moment, take for example these valve covers, you can see, you know, all the kind of blasted aluminium underneath the Cerakote, all the little profile that's been put into it by the people that did the vapor blasting before the Cerakote was applied is still there. So the character of the material remains in place underneath the Cerakote. I just like that. I think it adds something to the look and feel of the bike, something that gets kind of lost when you layer up thick layers of paint and thick layers of powder coat. I just don't think it looks as good as the Cerakote. So regardless of the cost, I think from an aesthetic standpoint, it is really, really good. Now, the other great thing about Cerakote is, despite the fact it's so incredibly thin, it is also pretty durable as well. It's durable in terms of being relatively scratch resistant, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but it's also quite chemical resistant as well. So again, a good choice to have up on your handlebar controls. If you've got a brake master cylinder and you need to be topping up your brake fluid every now and again, you don't need to worry quite so much about a little drop of brake fluid ruining the paint on your levers or on the perches and all that kind of stuff. It is much more resilient to chemical exposure than paint. So that's another good thing to know. The other thing when it comes to Cerakoting engine parts, and I've got some engine parts here that I'll talk about in a second, it is very heat resistant as well. I think it can be exposed up to ridiculous temperatures, something like 2000 degrees Fahrenheit or something stupid like that. So you can do things like exhausts and engine covers and all that kind of stuff, engine casing, and not have any problems. So that's quite nice if you're going to be doing lots of different parts across your bike and you want to have consistency with the same coating, so the same coating up on your handlebar controls as you've got on other parts of the bike, like your engine parts. You know, you don't need to worry about having to switch out to a high temperature paint for certain parts on the bike. So another little bonus there. Now, I want to talk about some of these engine parts and what it's been like to work with Cerakote in terms of some of the preparation work that I've done before putting these parts back on the bike. Now, the first thing to say more generally is I decided to change the valve covers on the R100CS. That bike originally came with the newer square valve covers, which at the time would have been used on bikes like the RT and things like that, the relatively more modern designed bikes. But the CS was a throwback to the R90S. So in my head, I've made a case to switching those valve covers back to being more in line with the bike that the CS celebrates. So we have these original style peanut valve covers about to go back on the bike. But when they came back from the Cerakoters, because I wanted to have them Cerakoted black, they were completely blacked out. And what I wanted to do was get to this kind of look where we have the beautiful exposed fin covers here. So this is a cast aluminium part, but when it came back from the Cerakoters, it was just completely glossed over in black. And it was the same case with the timing chest case here. As you can see here, it's now done. But when I got it, it didn't look like this. It was completely blacked out. And you'll probably find that with a lot of Cerakoters and powder coaters. If you say to them, well, you know, I want to get this look with polished fins and all that kind of stuff, they'll be like, yeah, great. You can do that. We'll just do what we do. We'll just Cerakote the thing or powder coat the thing. They're not going to want to get stuck into doing all this detailed work because it's very time consuming and, you know, it's just not what they do. So yeah, all the parts came back and I was a little bit nervous about doing this work, to be completely honest, because I was like, well, everyone's talking about how ridiculously tough Cerakote is. How the hell am I going to manage to get these fins exposed? What am I going to do? Will sandpaper even touch it? Well, as you can see here from some of these shots, I got myself some good quality sandpaper, different grits. I also got a nice cork sanding block, and set about trying to knock back the Cerakote from the extremities of the fins here. One of the things I did before getting too stuck into it was I made sure that I've masked everything off, because I'm an absolute klutz when it comes to things like this. So I have to go a little bit belt and braces, because yeah, I didn't want to accidentally rub off the wrong bit or do whatever. Probably slightly overkill, but anyway, whatever. And I was actually really surprised at how easily the Cerakote started to come away. I started with a 280 grit, and yeah, just gave it a light rub. As you can see, even with a relatively light rub here, because it's so thin, it does start to wear off pretty quickly. So the myths about Cerakotes, and I think they are myths a little bit, about, you know, how unbelievably durable it is, I think are slightly blown out of proportion. It probably is pretty durable compared to the same thickness of paint, or the same thickness of paint would barely be dusting over. But I think it's durable in comparison to its weight, if you like, its lightness. So yeah, it did take a considerable amount of sanding to get it all off, and unless you're, you know, worried about the fact that you're going to be accidentally sanding your parts, you know, I think it will probably be okay. But I was relatively surprised at how easy it came off. My kind of top tip for doing this, if you're going to be polishing back engine fins like this, is to absolutely do it with a sanding block. I 100% couldn't have done it without my sanding block, because if you were trying to do it with your fingers, you would accidentally, you know, end up curling the paper around those fins, and you'd have scratches all over the place in places where you don't want scratches. By using that sanding block, I was able to use the fins like rails and just skim straight over the top. And it was especially useful on sections like this, where you can see this is a little cutout in the fins that BMW had to put in there, because the frame kind of runs up very close to the engine here. So they've had to cut away some of the fins. And the design is as such that the filing of the exposed fins kind of ends in line with this cutaway. So by using that block across the whole piece like that and being able to keep everything flat, I was able to get that really nice kind of cut effect across the exposed bit of the fin, and where it dips down, we've managed to keep all the Cerakote in place there. So I'm really happy with how it all turned out. I think I can say I'm a bit of a Cerakote convert. We will have to see how well it actually holds out on the bike once we start getting a few miles underway. I have to say, quite glad, and thank you to so many of you guys in the comments who talked me out of doing the entire engine in Cerakote. I think it would have just been too black. But I'm really happy with these little details here, like, you know, the little black valve covers and the timing chest case with these exposed fins. I think this is going to look absolutely brilliant up there against that beautifully, freshly blasted aluminium case. It's going to look amazing, especially when you consider what an absolute state the whole thing was in when I took the engine out of the bike. You might remember some of those shots looking at the engine in the garage. It was a sorry state. It was a combination of years and years and years of neglect, plus I think somebody had just attacked it with a paintbrush sporadically, so it was looking a little bit sorry for itself. But if you compare what it looks like today versus what it looked like back then, it is just incredible in terms of how well this has come out. So I'm really, really happy with the result. All that hard work has paid off, lots of time and lots of money being invested in this stuff, but I just cannot wait now to start getting everything back into the garage and to start putting this bike back together. One of the really cool things that turned up in the post recently was a set of panniers from Trip Machine. The Warrior 2 suede panniers have arrived for the bike, and I've just got through a brand new set of luggage racks from Moto Works as well, and they fit absolutely perfectly. So while I'm doing bigger tours and things like that, I can get the Krausers on there, we can, you know, load it up. But for little weekends away and bumming around London and things like that, those Trip Machine Warrior 2 bags are going to look beautiful up on this bike. So I know I'm racing ahead of myself. I'm really thinking about details like that. But things are starting to happen. Things are starting to come together now. So yeah, onwards. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this has been useful if you're thinking about potentially using Cerakote to restore some of the parts on your classic bikes. For me, it gets the thumbs up. I think it looks good. It's nice and durable. It's pretty easy to work with. It really kind of retains the character in those classic old parts, gives a little bit of color to the bike, but also maintains that patina and the look and feel of the machine. So for me, as long as it holds out and doesn't immediately fall off, which I don't think it will, I think Cerakote will be absolutely, you know, on my kind of list of things to do for future builds for sure. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Until the next one, ride safe.